today, let's make a dragon egg, because everybody needs a dragon egg. Alright guys, so in this video, I'm going to make this dragon egg right here. My first attempt at it, so there were some issues, but you'll find that out as you watch along as I'm going. But other than that, please do enjoy. Please subscribe and like, really helps out the channel. Let's see how I did this. So to begin with, I'm going to use this mold release right here and line the inside of this cup with it. I don't know how much it will help, but I'm sure it can't hurt, so I'm hoping to make the release a little easier once I demold everything. The next step is to mix up some epoxy resin. So here I'm marking the cup, and I have part A and part B on this resin, this particular resin, and I do like this resin because it takes a while for it to set up, so it gives me plenty of time to work with it. Now on my first batch, I'm going to mix up one color, which is I'm going to use 3 different colors, which are going to be the red, the orange, and the gold, and that's going to all blend together to make my fire look for the dragon's egg. Make sure the resin is mixed pretty good. I add the gold here, and this is going to be my first color that I'm going to pour. It's going to give a yellowish gold at the top. The second pour is going to be my orange color, and this is going to mix well with the yellow that is going to end up being on the top of the egg, and then it'll blend down into an orange until it gets to my final color, which will be red, which will be the bottom pour. Okay, now for the final color of this pour is going to be bright red, and that's going to end up at the bottom of the egg. So the egg will start out as a red blending into a bright orange, blending into a gold color, yellowish at the top. Alright, so now I put everything into the pressure pot to stay overnight, but as I did that, I noticed that the pine cone actually started rising up. So although I don't show it on camera, what I ended up doing was pulling that lid back off and using a piece of wood to hold the pine cone down into that cup, and I ended up running some duct tape across the top there to keep it in place. Okay, so it's the next day. The pine cone has been sitting in here overnight, so let's see how that looks. All right, so everything stayed in place, it looks like. That's a big plus. Get this out of the way. Now I guess we'll see how well the mold release worked on this. Could be interesting though. That is in there pretty good. So I think I'm going to need another method to crack the case here. So this little stick actually worked out pretty good to help pull that away. So we might take a break while I get this all off. I'm probably going to have to use something else to pull that away, I'm thinking. Like maybe something like this. Well, it's actually pulling away quite easy, but considering almost had it. Ta-da! All right, so there we have our fire lollipop here. So what I'll do is I'll cut this off, but I like the way that it's gone from this gold here through the yellow into the red. So it does look the way that I envisioned and hoped that it would look. So I'll get some close-up shots of this for you, and you can check it out. But this looks good. So now we'll go about making our dragon's egg out of this. I think you'll agree that the blending of these colors really gives it a fiery look. Now I ended up taking this over to the bandsaw to cut that stick off, and that will eventually be the bottom of the dragon's egg. Once on the lathe, I just basically chucked the bottom of the cup into my Nova grip there, and I'm using a negative rake scraper to flatten out the bottom of this so that I can eventually put a mortise in it so that I could attach it to the Nova headstock. Now here I'm going to use my calipers to mark out the spot where I'm going to cut out my mortise so that I can flip this around onto the jaws. Sorry for the bad angle. I didn't realize that I was blocking it out most of the time, but you can see how I made the guidelines for hollowing all of this out for my mortise. Here is reversed around and using the mortise to hold on to everything. Just locking it in, getting it ready to start spinning. I wanted a little bit of extra support, so I brought up the tailstock, figuring that I could use that for most of my cutting until I got to the end where I needed to round off the top part of the egg. Then I would remove the tailstock, but until then it's just a good idea just to have that on there and get that extra additional support. Now cutting can start in earnest. I'm mainly going to be using a negative rake scraper bit on the end of my carbide. So this works really well for any type of epoxy resin and wood combination. At least in my experience, it has worked really well for me. And it makes a nice even cut. So the first cuts are going to just get this thing rounded, because as you can remember, the cup had different little levels to it, and it needed to first get to a cylindrical shape to make the cutting a little bit more smooth and consistent all the way across. Here I'm going to use my 1/8 inch parting tool to make a point that's going to be the bottom of my egg. Now I don't want to go too far in there because I do have a mortise there, and towards the bottom of this egg I noticed that some of it was a bit rubbery and it wasn't cured completely. So obviously I didn't have my mix done up really well on that. So that's when I mix the epoxy, I should have taken a little bit more time to mix it completely. And really with the epoxy that I'm using, there's no reason not to do this, because I've timed it. It takes about 45 to 50 minutes before it actually starts setting up, and that's plenty of time to mix. So after this egg, I made sure that I've always mixed epoxy really well so that I don't come across that issue anymore. Well, I finally decided to remove the tailstock and start working on the very top of the egg here. And for most of the egg, I went back and forth between the carbide tip negative rake and just my negative rake scraper. And you'll see at one point I use a 1/8 inch parting tool to round the bottom. So because there was such a tight area there, I couldn't put the carbide or the negative rake tool in. I just didn't have a thin enough tool to work with, so I ended up using the parting tool to create my bottom arc on the egg here. So I'm getting down to the final shape of the egg, and it really got a little smaller than I thought I would have to go. And again, that was that problem, because I did have some pieces that were fragmented. They sort of chipped out, and I think that was just in the casting. And then also I had to get through that bottom part that was rubberized. And once I got through all of that, where I got into some completely cured epoxy resin, it actually turned out to be just perfect and fit the size of the pine cone, so that the ends of the pine cone petals were extending out through the edge there, so that you see them relatively clearly. At this point I started sanding the egg, and I started out with 80 grit sandpaper and then slowly worked up through my different grits. So I started at 80, went to 100, 120, then 180, then 240, 320, 400, and finally using 600 grit to get a nice relatively smooth finish on the egg. Now partway through my sanding I noticed that I really didn't like the shape of the bottom of the egg, so I wanted to adjust it a little bit. So I brought my tool rest back up and then started trimming up the egg and cleaning that all up. And I think I had a little bit of a chip out also, so I wanted to get rid of that in addition. So that's why you see I'm going back to the tools here, and then eventually I'll start back with the 80 grit and work my way through all the sandpaper again. So during my sanding I noticed that I had a little bit of an indentation in the top of the egg from where my tailstock was pushing up against it. So I wanted to sort of remedy that. So I got out the 80 grit again and worked my way through, especially on the end, through all the other grits until I got down to the 600 again. And then finished that up with sanding the entire egg. Okay, now I'm at the finishing stage, and I like to use the Axe Abrasive sanding paste. This stuff just works great. You put a little bit of it on a paper towel, wipe it onto, and in this case, my dragon's egg. And once I get it all wiped on evenly, a nice low coat of it, I turn on a slow speed, let the abrasive do its work and remove some of the scratches, then crank up the speed a little bit faster and let it get a little hot with a new piece of paper towel. And this sort of bakes that thing in and just gives it a beautiful shine, and really does a great job of getting rid of any scratches that may have been left over from the sanding process. Now it's time to bring in the Axe Polish and Restoring Paste, and this is just a finer grit, and it really does give a nice polish and shine to everything and just eliminates whatever scratches you may have left. Now there are some links below that save you a little bit on that, so the first order that you want to make through that, use that link. I think it saves you 10 or 15%, I can't remember, but it'll say on the link down there. But you're going to really like this stuff. It just does a fantastic job for any type of epoxy resin or acrylic resin stuff that you have, and also does a great job on just finishing on wood bowls. It's just really some slick stuff. Okay, so for the final part I used the one-step acrylic polish, and I wipe that on and let it dry, then wipe it off, and then after that I use some marine polish for using on boats, and that gives a real nice gloss and a good protection on it. So once those two steps are done, I'm getting pretty close to the end of my dragon's egg. I'm just going to have to separate it here in a minute, which you'll see right about now. Using my 1/8 inch parting tool, I just work my way in there and continue cutting it while my hand's just loosely around the egg. Then once it makes the final cut, it falls right into my hand and makes the whole process real easy to separate it from the base. Next I head on over to my belt sander and just flatten the bottom part of the egg there so that it sits on the ground nice and even and gets everything smooth right on the bottom of my egg. At my workbench I bring out my sanding blocks there, and I believe this one starts out at 120 grit, and I'm gonna just smooth down the bottom that's left from my belt sander. Then I can move on to my 220 grit on the board, on the flat sanding board, and just finish up the bottom nice and neat. Now from here I'm going to go through all of the paste again. I'm going to start with the Axe Sanding Abrasive Paste, then work my way on to the polishing paste from Axe, and then after that the one-step polish, acrylic polish, then finally the marine polish wax. Okay, this is my first attempt at a dragon's egg, and I don't know if it looks so much like an egg as it does, I don't know, a pine cone in resin, actually. So, but I don't know if you can see it really well, but when the light shines through, I'll try and get a close-up shot of it too. It really looks good. So what I'm thinking I might do is drill out the bottom here and put a light in it and make it sort of a night light type thing. I think that'd be kind of cool. But yeah, you know, my first attempt at this, so I thought it came out pretty good. It was fun to do. You know, I had a couple hits where I cracked up stuff, but I also had some issues with the resin was not completely cured in spots, and so it was kind of rubbery. And so I got to make sure that on the next one I do that, I mix up the resin really well, because that did not go over so good. So and it made it a little difficult in cutting it, but you know, it all still came out looking pretty good. So I'm happy with it. Right now I have a nice paperweight, but like I said, if I drill it out and put a light in it, that might be a kind of a really cool looking night light. And I think I've seen other people do that on YouTube. So I think I will try that.